This is Dennis Raimondi. I'm here with Peter Giuliani, thecoffeeleague.com, our podcast. And Peter has quite a background in coffee. He went from May 2000 to August 2012. He was a co-owner and director of coffee at Counterculture in Durham, North Carolina. And from August 12th until the present, he is the director of Symposium with Specialty Coffee Association of America, the SCAA. Well known in the coffee world, tremendously knowledgeable, and I hope today to extract as much knowledge as I can from you on coffee. So, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Oh, thank you.
Peter, you're originally, we discussed this off the air, from Southern California, from San Diego, Encinitas area. When did you first become involved in, were you a coffee drinker when you were young? Did you take a job as a barista? How did you enter the world of coffee?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. Well, first of all, I come from a family of coffee drinkers. My grandfather was legendary for his consumption of coffee. An Italian American, drank coffee all day. And so my nana gave me, milk with coffee as a kid. That was a part of growing up in my household. But then when I became a teenager, I started to hang out in coffee houses. I liked coffee houses. There was one near my house that had a very sort of bohemian feel to it, and so I started to spend a lot of time there. And eventually, I got literally. Somebody didn't show up for a shift one day, and someone behind a counter literally threw an apron at me, and I had to decide whether to go to my college classes that day or skip them and work in the coffee shop. And I did the latter thing.
Wise choice.
And so yeah. And so that was at a place called the Panikin in Encinitas.
I know it well. Yep.
Yeah.
Still there.
And yeah, it's a really cool place for your listeners. It's in an old train station, like 100-year-old train station, and a cool place. And at that time, it was filled with young people like me who like to go to record stores and play music and stuff like that. And that's what attracted me to it. But within a few months of working there, I fell in love with coffee, and really since then I've never done anything else. I was a serious barista. I wanted to really be sort of a teacher of other baristas, and so I did that. And I wound up writing, sort of creating a little training program for our shops. And then later I started managing shops and managing multiple coffee shops within the Panikin. And then I went to work for, we started a wholesale division. I started working on the wholesale side, training people about coffee, bring coffee to restaurants and coffee shops and stuff like that. And then, so that's why, so I wound up doing that for 13 years before moving to North Carolina and joining Counterculture.
Oh. Well, let me just ask, when you were involved, when you first took your job in coffee, was the culture of coffee quite different than it is now? And was it more darker roast, sort of an espresso bar type atmosphere? And was the product very different back then?
Yeah, yes. The short answer is yes. And I love to think about the way things were different and the way things were the same.
Right.
The things that were different then is one thing that you really put your finger on is the roast of coffee in specialty coffee shops was much darker than it is today. Mm-hmm. And really people were super proud of that. That was the way we distinguished ourselves from grocery store coffee, which was roasted much lighter. And so if and then of course, dark roasted coffee had all these sort of exotic European names: French roast, Italian roast, continental roast, etc. And that was all about being dark, and dark meant sophisticated. So, and in that sense, there was a lot of I think, emphasis on kind of strengths, you know. Good coffee was brewed stronger, it tasted stronger because it was roasted darker. So there was that sort of a real sort of focus on intensity. Now, that said, I don't want to give you the impression, I think a lot of people, because of that dark roastedness, people feel like the coffee was burned, it wasn't very high quality. That's not true. You know, there is a real sophistication around roasting dark, and a lot of companies did a really good job at that time. And I just remember how delicious the coffee seemed to me at the time. And it's coffee that would be, you know, it's today the kind of coffee that a roast that you associate with Peet's. I would say Peet's was really the archetype for that time, and they're a great example of somebody of a company that really understands how to roast coffee dark, and so that's what it was like. The things that were the same is sort of, you know, there was a real youthful energy around being a barista. You know, and there was other little details that I think that are interesting, that are different and the same. So one of the big differences is I remember how little coffee we made for people to go, right? So that the thing that's so ubiquitous now about somebody that gets a coffee latte in a paper cup and goes to their car and drinks it on their way to work, that happened, but it was such a minority. I remember something like 10 or 15% of our total sales were for to-go coffee.
Wow.
Whereas now it's the opposite. Now, if you put 10% of your, you know, or 15% of your coffee in porcelain cups, it's unusual. So that part is really flipped. There was a lot more emphasis on sort of coffee house culture and, you know, going to a coffee house and hanging around for a while you drank coffee. So that part's also very different.
Wow. Now tell us about, okay, so then you go from Panikins in Encinitas, San Diego, North County, and now you wind up at Counterculture in Durham, North Carolina. How did that happen, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I was kind of, you know, it was, as you probably know, on a coffee salary, it was sort of difficult to live in Southern California. And so I started to think about different places in the United States to live. And somebody at the Specialty Coffee Association of America connected me with a guy named Fred Hauk, who had co-founded with Brett Smith a small coffee roaster in North Carolina, and they were looking to bring a coffee person on. And so this person in the industry introduced me, gave my phone number to Fred. And one day my phone rang, and I picked it up, and a voice on the other side of the phone said, "Do you believe in fate?" and that was Fred, and he had kind of gotten the rundown on my expertise and knew that I'd been involved in wholesale coffee, and he was looking for somebody to sort of entrust the coffee program at the business to. And so I came to work for Counterculture based on that one telephone conversation. Like a month and a half later, I was in North Carolina roasting coffee at Counterculture.
What was the coffee scene a lot different in North Carolina than it was in California back then? Yeah.
Oh, it was and it was different in a really cool way. You know, at that time, Counterculture was really small. We were roasting out of a little, you know, kind of an industrial park kind of place with you know, one of those metal roll-up doors, and it was really, you know, it was a very unusual thing, especially, you know, there weren't the kind of there wasn't the kind of scene like there was in Southern California. Now, there was a lot of cool coffee happening at the time, you know, especially on University of North Carolina. There was a really cool coffee shop on campus at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And there was also a really cool kind of culinary scene happening there. There was a sort of a awakening of Southern, a reimagining of Southern cuisine happening that was in part inspired by California cuisine. So there was a lot of interest in good ingredients, good restaurants, and coffee. And Fred and Brett really fit. Imagine counterculture fitting into that sort of scene. But the neat thing about having worked in coffee in California for so long, and then coming to a place like North Carolina, where coffee was a few years. I don't want to make them seem like they were backwards, but the trends were just a few years delayed in North Carolina than they were in California, which made me feel like I had sort of ESP about what was going to happen next, you know?
Right.
And so it was a really fun experience. There was some other people at the company. Cindy Ludvigsen, who was then Cindy Chang, had come to work in North Carolina after having some experience in Minneapolis working for Caribou. And so, you know, we all sort of had this idea about what could the ideal coffee company look like, and that's really how we.
Were you all fairly in sync about what you wanted to do?
Yeah. You know what? It's funny. It seemed obvious at the time. So we're talking about in the year 2000, 2001, 2002 at this point, and some of the things that seemed like almost like really imperative is, well, the first thing is there was the bottom had fallen out of the coffee market that year. There was the Vietnam came into the global coffee market in a really big way very suddenly, and it sort of destabilized prices, and prices plummeted to these lows that they hadn't seen in decades. And suddenly coffee farmers were facing, you know, literal famine in coffee producing countries. And there was a real sense of urgency, like, about how we gonna, you know, as specialty coffee that are committed to sustainable coffee production and coffee farmers and stuff, how are we going to do something about this? And so engaging directly with farmers seemed like a real imperative, you know, and maximizing the amount of financial returns we could get to coffee farmers seemed very imperative. At the same time, in the culinary world, I mentioned like this sort of connection with the culinary scene. And the culinary scene at that time, you know, the hero were people like Alice Waters, who were emphasizing working directly with local farms for restaurants. And if you apply that idea to coffee, there's of course very few local farms in coffee, but you could do something like a local farm just by developing a relationship with a certain community in a coffee producing country, or getting committed to a certain group of farmers or individual farmers. And that was a sort of an application of the local food movement, and you know, emphasizing quality.
Right. Was this also happening in California as well as the East Coast at this point?
You mean in the culinary world?
Well, in the culinary world, and also looking and thinking to develop these relationships with the small farms and other, you know, in the coffee producing countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, well, the thing, there was the people that at that time that were really leading the way were a guy named David Griswold, who had started a company called, well, at first it was called Aztec Harvest, working with farmers in Mexico, and then Sustainable Harvest. And he really pioneered this idea of working directly with farmers, in that very, with a real emphasis on sustainability. There was a company in Olympia, Washington called Badbrook and Bronson that was really leading the way there too. And then, you know, us at Counterculture, we started doing our thing, starting with a relationship in Nicaragua, and going from there, and then Intelligentsia. Then I started working really closely with Jeff Watts at Intelligentsia, as collaborators and supporting each other as we did this thing. And so it was an exciting time in coffee. It really felt like a moment of change at that time, as this small group of sort of coffee people were trying this way of sort of, thinking maybe a little bit differently about the way our supply chain works.
Right. Yeah. No, I think coffee in all of agriculture could be one of the leaders in terms of really thinking the whole idea now with third wave coffee, as I understand it, and this is all relative. I've been studying this the last few months, so my knowledge is very limited. But what I'm seeing is that, with this, what they call third wave coffee, it's where the bean comes from and how it got to the cup and how the farmer was treated and what about the soil and the sustainability in every aspect. And I personally think that's fantastic. And I just spent a lot of time in Scandinavia, went to many cafes, met with a lot of baristas and roasters there. And I think that's been more the case in Europe for a long time. But it's very similar to what's going on here. I think the U.S. is, if anything, caught up and in some ways even surpassed many areas of Europe in regard to that. Let me ask you this, though. As counterculture became bigger, as you mentioned, Intelligentsia, I think, was purchased by Pete's. As things got, as companies, as they all became larger, uh, uh, did that change things much, or did the commitment to quality and specialty coffee, did it remain the same?
Yeah. So I think the so there's certain things. I think one of the things that people sort of assume is that as coffee companies grow, they're sort of it maybe is more difficult to do high quality, or you get distracted from that, or something like that. That's sort of the assumption that people make. And in my experience, it was exactly the opposite. You need you need a certain amount of scale in order to do some of these things with coffee. And then as I learned just a ton as I went along, and many of the assumptions that I made early on about what quality meant and what sustainability meant and what my partnerships with farmers were going to look like. Almost all of those assumptions were challenged from year to year. I learned things like for me, I learned things like how important it was to just make a commitment to a coffee farm that lasted, a farmer that lasted, that you would measure that relationship in decades, and not try to do this sort of the instinctive thing about quality, which is like to try to choose from the marketplace of, you just taste a bunch of coffees and buy the best tasting ones. And then, by doing that, you're able to really get, you may have to buy some coffee from a farmer one year that he's having a tough year and the quality might be off a little bit. But by accepting the coffee that year, and then, but thinking in the long term, you've got a much better, you have a commitment. And then when things go the opposite way, the relationship is still there. So, so those, growing into a larger company with more coffee moving through, with more people involved, a lot of things became easier.
Interesting.
I left Counterculture now 5 years ago. They've continued to grow in the meantime, and in many, many ways, their coffee is better than it ever was when I was there. Because you learn things about coffee. One of the beautiful things about coffee, by the way, is that most people in it have a story like mine, where you never meant to go to coffee. You go into coffee. It's not like you studied anything in college relevant to it. You just kind of stumbled your way into it and learned by doing it. And that's a lovely thing about coffee, that you can sort of just kind of figure your way through it. But that means learning by doing means making a lot of mistakes and learning a lot along the way. So it takes a long time to really develop your chops in coffee. Right. At least when you're doing it that way. And and that was true for me. I'm shocked at the amount of things that I learned to do differently, particularly over these years that we're talking about.
Right. It's an amazing story. And The only way to get a PhD in coffee is to do it the way you did it. I think there's no way you could study this and do it otherwise. Tell us about, Peter, tell us about the Specialty Coffee Association of America and what its focus is on. And also, I believe that specialty coffee is defined by a scale that is actually been uh, overseen by the Specialty Coffee Association of America, that if you score above
Yeah,
80 on that scale, I was reading about it. So a little bit about that organization and about how
sure.
you actually define specialty coffee.
Yeah, so the Specialty Coffee Association of America was founded in the early 80s, 1982.
Oh, so it's been around a
And
while. Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's been around for a while. And it was in my coming up in coffee, that was the way that you got connected with other coffee people. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and because I was a young person that wanted to make my way in the coffee world, it was so essential to my education, my networking. All my mentors came to me through the Specialty Coffee Association. My connection with Counterculture, as I said, came through the Specialty Coffee Association. So it was this really important sort of thing for me, and I developed and still have a deep affection for that for that association, more than most people would feel for a trade association. It has a really important function
Mm-hmm.
of that, and so I maintained while at Counterculture, I maintained a relationship with the organization, serving on its board and stuff, and so as I said, for the last 5 years, I've worked for the association, doing a number of things. You mentioned, well, one thing I should mention before I go into the grading, the definition of specialty thing. One of the exciting things that's happened in the past year is that we are no longer the Specialty Coffee Association of America. We came together with the Specialty Coffee Association of Europe and
Mm-hmm.
unified as one organization. Now we're just the Specialty Coffee Association,
Okay.
and working at a global level for specialty coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an exciting time because coffee is so global. So you mentioned the definition and the standards. So one of the things that we do is set the standards for specialty coffee in the industry, including the question of what specialty is and what isn't. Now, this is a really complicated question, because coffee has so many steps in the process, right? So in order for a coffee that you get in a coffee shop in Scandinavia to be special, it has to come from a special place, a special farm, cultivated by a special farmer who knew what he was doing, a special microclimate, etc. The miller had to do the job just right and not mess it up in the process of that. Make sure that not introduce any defects
Mm-hmm.
or problems. Then it needs to be transported carefully, promptly, without losing any of its unique character. Then a roaster has to apply their craft to it to reveal the potential flavor that was
Mm-hmm.
in it since the farm. Then it needs to go to a barista that has so all of these steps introduce ways to make the coffee better or ways to make it worse. And so there's all these different places that you can evaluate whether coffee is special or specialty or not. So you've just mentioned one of them. We've got the coffee tasting protocol is called cupping. It's the traditional way that the coffee trade has tasted coffee for about the last 120 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we educate the trade to a protocol of coffee cupping that includes scoring the coffee on a 1 to 100 scale. It's complicated. There's different categories that you can use to rate the coffee. Things like fragrance and aroma and acidity and body and aftertaste and the number of defects.
And then could I ask, You then would have to certify somebody who could do that type of evaluation.
Exactly, exactly. And we do that. We educate coffee tasters to do this thing, and along with a sister organization of ours called the Coffee Quality Institute, we certify coffee tasters via a program called the Q, and also there's another coffee tasters certificate that is sort of the sommelier of coffee, and these people know how to score coffee properly and can assign a value to it. If it gets an 80 or higher, then that's what we call specialty coffee.
Well, it's wonderful to know how much goes into, somebody goes in and they have into a cafe and they have a wonderful experience drinking coffee. There's a lot that goes into that, and it's I think it adds to the enjoyment to know that much about it. Go ahead.
And coffee really is, a miracle when you think of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is a miraculous thing that coffee can be grown on a farm in Kenya, right? Make its way to the, over the, through a port and trucks and trains and ships, and make it to a port on the West Coast in San Francisco, and make it to a roaster down in San Diego, and then be roasted and prepared by a barista and handed to a person. And that person that drinks that coffee at the end can recognize that it comes from Kenya just by the attributes that are in it.
Right.
That's an amazing thing. That's
right.
And it never ceases to astound me.
Wow. Let me ask you a couple of more questions before we finish up. One is, do you ever miss being a barista? And number two, what are your own coffee habits? How often do you drink coffee, and what do you like?
Yeah. So just today, I said to a colleague how much I missed being a barista. Somebody got our phone number and was calling, asking some questions about coffee, and my interaction with her reminded me how much I love interacting with people over coffee, and that's the thing I really miss about being a barista. I fantasize every week about going back to the coffee bar and just making people coffee. It's my favorite thing to do still. So I do miss being a barista all the time. My own coffee habits are, I think, simpler than people think they are. I don't drink an incredibly large amount of coffee, and it's because I love to make my coffee special every day. I'm fortunate to work in an industry and have a network of people, and so I can, people will send me coffee to taste, and I've got my favorites, and my friends that send me coffee, and so I get to drink coffee from all sorts of different roasters all over the world every day, and I just prepare it simply in my kitchen using a little pour-over brewer, and that's of course, like many people, coffee preparation is the thing I do first thing in the morning while I'm alone, before my kids are up, and it's kind of a special moment for me in that way.
I think it's great, and anybody knows anything about counterculture, the standards that you've set there are incredible, and ultimately you're in a business, I believe, that brings people a lot of happiness, and in many ways brings people together, because it's not just a drink; it's the whole culture that gathers around it, that forms around it, and it's different from country to country, is my experience. But it's enjoyable and fun in every country that I've been to and gone to a good cafe. So certainly you've been a pioneer in that.
Yeah, well, thank you. And that's one of the things that I enjoy the most now. One of the things that I do with the Specialty Coffee Association is lead our research work. We are involved in a lot of scientific research, and also social research and sustainability research and economic research and stuff. And what you're saying is actually a really beautiful kind of area of study. Is the way coffee interacts with, can bring people together, you know, and serve this social function in our communities. And that happens in coffee producing countries too, around on the other side of coffee, on the coffee farms, and it's really one of the most special and unique thing about coffee, and it's something that always fascinates me about it.
Right, right. As somebody that's just learning more and more about it recently, it's something that I've certainly have observed. We'll have to have you back on to talk more about that specifically. I think it's
Cool,
fascinating. And but
great.
thank you so very much for your time today.
Oh, it was very nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Great.